I disappeared, and no one even noticed.
This is the story of a woman who felt completely invisible. Not poor, not sick, just gone, like she had disappeared from her own life while everyone else moved on without her. And then, at 54 years old, she discovered one small habit that brought her back. If you've ever felt like life happened around you instead of for you, stay with me. This one might be about you. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Eleanor Hayes, and for most of her life she was the kind of woman other people leaned on. She grew up the second of 4 children on a farm outside Zanesville, Ohio, where her mother taught her early that a woman's worth was measured in what she could hold together for everyone else. Eleanor met Richard Hayes at 19, at a church picnic neither of them had wanted to attend, and by 21 she was married and pregnant with her first child. For 29 years she raised 3 children in a modest brick house on Maple Grove Avenue in a small town outside Columbus, where everybody knew everybody, and nothing much ever happened without the whole street hearing about it eventually. Eleanor was the woman who remembered every birthday on the block, who kept a spare key to half the houses on Maple Grove Avenue, who showed up with a casserole the moment anyone so much as sneezed twice in a row. She raised her children, David, Margaret, and the youngest, Thomas, with a kind of quiet devotion that never once asked to be noticed. Richard worked at the county's largest manufacturing plant for 31 years, steady and unremarkable in the way that good, dependable men often are, and every evening he came home to a porch light Eleanor kept burning, rain or shine, until every one of her children had made it safely through the front door. What almost no one on Maple Grove Avenue understood, not even her own family, was how much of Eleanor's sense of self had been quietly built on being the one who was needed. She rarely spoke of her own ambitions, if she still had any left by her 40s, because there was never time to ask the question, let alone answer it. Her sister Barbara once asked her, half joking, what she would do with her life if the children were grown and the house went quiet. Eleanor had laughed the question off entirely. That, she said, is a problem for another woman, someday far off in the future. She could not have known how soon that future was coming, or how unrecognizable it would leave her. The unraveling began, as these things often do, with something almost too small to notice. Her youngest son Thomas moved out for college in late August, the last of her 3 children to leave the house on Maple Grove Avenue. Eleanor told herself it was simply the natural order of things, the same thing every mother eventually faces, an empty hallway and a kitchen table set for 2 instead of 5. She smiled at the neighbors when they asked how she was adjusting. She told her sister she was fine, but something inside her had already begun to shift, quietly in a way she could not yet name, and would not fully understand for another 18 months when the rest of her carefully built world came apart at once. 14 months after Thomas left for college, on an ordinary Thursday evening in late October, Richard collapsed in the garage while carrying in a bag of mulch he had bought earlier that day for a flower bed he never got the chance to plant. Eleanor found him within minutes, but the ambulance could not reach him in time. He was pronounced dead at the hospital just after 9 that night, and Eleanor would later say that the strangest part of that entire evening was how ordinary it had started, how she had complained, only that morning, about him tracking dirt across the kitchen floor. She had no way of knowing it would be the last complaint she ever got to make to him. The funeral drew nearly 200 people, a testament to 31 years of quiet decency, and for 3 days afterward, Eleanor's house was full of casseroles and sympathy cards and relatives who did not quite know what to say. But the hardest moment did not come during the service, or even at the burial. It came 3 days later, on a Tuesday evening, when the last of the relatives had gone home, and Eleanor sat alone in her kitchen, and realized, with a clarity that frightened her, that no one was coming through that front door. Not that night. Not the next one. Not ever again. The porch light she had kept burning for 30 years suddenly had no one left to guide home. For the 2 years that followed, Eleanor's world narrowed into something small and quiet, and to anyone watching closely, deeply concerning. She stopped attending her Thursday morning church group, the same one where she had once organized meal trains for half the congregation. She let her garden go to weeds, the same garden Richard had spent every spring tending with an almost boyish enthusiasm. She woke late, some days not until well past noon, and she rarely left the house except for groceries, timed carefully for the hours when the store would be empty and she would not have to make conversation with anyone who might ask how she was really doing. Her daughter Margaret, who had moved 2 states away to Pennsylvania after her own marriage, called every single Sunday evening without fail, and every Sunday evening, Eleanor gave the same careful, practiced answer. "I'm fine, sweetheart, just tired." Margaret believed her, mostly because she wanted to, and because Eleanor had always been the strong one, the one who held everyone else together during hard seasons, not the one who fell apart. It is easy to believe the people we love are fine when the alternative is too frightening to sit with for very long. But there was something Margaret did not know, something Eleanor had not told a single living soul in 2 full years. There was also her eldest son, David, and the story between David and his mother was more complicated than anyone in the family liked to discuss out loud. In the year following Richard's death, David had tried more than once to convince Eleanor to sell the house on Maple Grove Avenue and move closer to him and his wife in Chicago. Eleanor refused every time, and what began as gentle suggestion eventually curdled into frustration on David's side and quiet withdrawal on Eleanor's. By the second year, their phone calls had grown shorter and further apart, until they stopped altogether sometime around Eleanor's 53rd birthday, a birthday she spent entirely alone, though she never told a single member of her family that fact. What none of them yet understood, not Margaret, not David, not even Barbara, was how close Eleanor had come, quietly, to a decision none of them would have recovered from easily. She never spoke the words out loud, not even to herself in the privacy of her own kitchen, but there were nights in that second year when the silence of the house felt less like grief and more like an answer to a question she had stopped being able to outrun. She told no one. She kept the porch light on out of habit rather than hope, and she might have stayed in that quiet, dangerous holding pattern indefinitely had it not been for a phone call on an ordinary Tuesday evening in October that would change the direction of everything that came after it. That call came from Margaret, and it was not Margaret's voice that broke something open in Eleanor, but her granddaughter Lily's, a 7-year-old with a habit of asking the kinds of questions adults spend their whole lives learning to avoid. While her mother was on the phone with Eleanor, Lily tugged at Margaret's sleeve and asked loud enough for Eleanor to hear clearly through the receiver why Grandma always sounded so sad and whether Grandma still loved them the way she used to. Margaret laughed it off in the moment, the way parents often do when a child says something too honest for the room to hold. Eleanor did not laugh. She sat frozen in her kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, and felt something inside her finally give way. She did not sleep at all that night. Around 4 in the morning, unable to lie still any longer, Eleanor got up, made a pot of coffee she had no real intention of drinking, and carried it out to the back porch, wrapped in Richard's old wool cardigan, the one she had never once been able to bring herself to give away. The sky outside was still fully black, the street silent except for the occasional passing car on the main road 2 blocks over. She had sat on that porch 100 times since Richard died, always waiting for something she could not name, some sign that the life she was living was still worth continuing. What she did not know, what she could not possibly have known, was that within the hour, a single conversation with a neighbor she had barely exchanged 10 words with in 3 years would set in motion a transformation that would eventually surprise everyone who thought they already understood exactly who Eleanor Hayes was. At precisely 5:20 that morning, a woman appeared on the sidewalk in front of Eleanor's house, walking briskly, a small spiral notebook tucked under one arm. Eleanor recognized her only vaguely, a retired schoolteacher from 2 streets over named Carol Whitfield, a woman Eleanor had exchanged little more than a passing wave with over the better part of a decade. Eleanor called out before she could stop herself, asking what on earth Carol was doing outside at that hour of the morning. Carol smiled, entirely unbothered by the question, and walked over to the porch steps as though she had somehow been expecting it for years. What she said next was simple enough on its surface, but it would end up reaching further into Eleanor's life than either woman yet understood that morning. Carol sat down on the porch steps without waiting to be invited, which somehow did not feel like an intrusion at all. She told Eleanor that 5 years earlier she had been sitting in almost the exact same kind of silence Eleanor now lived inside, grieving a difficult divorce after 31 years of marriage, raising 2 grown children who no longer needed her daily presence, convinced that the most meaningful chapters of her own life were already behind her for good. Eleanor asked, quietly, what had changed for her. Carol's answer was not a secret formula or some miracle cure sold on late-night television. She said she had simply stopped waiting for someone else to need her, and started giving herself 1 uninterrupted hour every single morning, before the rest of the world woke up and made its usual demands on her time. Eleanor was skeptical, and she said so plainly. An hour did not undo 2 years of grief. It did not bring Richard back, and it certainly would not repair whatever had broken between her and David, or stop her granddaughter from asking why Grandma sounded so sad on the phone. Carol did not argue the point directly. Instead, she opened her notebook and showed Eleanor page after page of handwritten essays, small reflections she had written in those early morning hours over the past 5 years, some of them later published in the local paper, one of them read aloud at a community fundraiser that had raised more money for the local food pantry than any single event the town had held in over a decade. This is not magic, Carol told her, closing the notebook gently. It is simply proof of what happens when a woman decides on purpose to stop disappearing. Before she left that morning, Carol tore a single page from her notebook and wrote down a plan, simple enough to fit in the palm of Eleanor's hand. Wake at 5:15. Sit down with a notebook, even if there is nothing to say at first. Give it 90 days, not because 90 days is some magic number, but because it is long enough to find out whether a person is capable of showing up for herself day after day without anyone else watching or applauding along the way. Eleanor did not answer right away, but something in her had already quietly decided. The next morning, Eleanor's alarm went off at 5:15, and every instinct in her body told her to silence it and go straight back to sleep. She did not. She sat at her kitchen table with the notebook her daughter had given her 2 Christmases earlier, still wrapped in its original plastic, untouched all this time, and she wrote a single honest sentence at the top of the very first blank page. I feel invisible, and I do not know how to stop. It was not eloquent. It was not the beginning of some inspiring speech she had rehearsed. It was simply true, and for the first time in 2 full years, Eleanor had said something true out loud, even if only to a piece of paper no one else would ever read. The first 2 weeks were harder than anything she had expected going in. Her body ached for sleep in a way that felt almost punishing, a deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with how many hours she actually slept. Some mornings she wrote nothing at all but her own name, over and over down the page, unable to find any other words worth putting down. Other mornings, the grief simply arrived uninvited before she had written a single sentence. The moment the house went quiet enough for her to hear her own thoughts clearly, she nearly quit on day 9. Sitting at that kitchen table at 5 in the morning, fully prepared to turn off the alarm permanently and never look at that notebook again. What stopped her, in the end, was not willpower at all. It was the memory of her granddaughter's voice on the phone, asking whether Grandma still loved them, a question Eleanor had quietly decided to answer with more than words alone. By the 3rd week, something in Eleanor's mornings began, quietly and without fanfare, to shift. She found herself writing not just about her grief, but about her marriage, about the early years with Richard at that church picnic neither of them had wanted to attend, about her own mother, a woman who had raised 4 children alone on a struggling farm through most of the 1960s and had never once been given the chance to tell her own story to anyone who cared to listen. Eleanor realized, somewhere around week 5, that she was no longer simply filling time before the day officially began. She was listening to herself for the first time in years, and what she heard genuinely surprised her. It was also around this time that Eleanor began, slowly and with real hesitation, to reach back out to David in Chicago. She did not mention the notebook or Carol or any of what was quietly changing inside her. She simply called on a Sunday morning instead of waiting for him to call her, and asked how his wife's new job was going, a small ordinary question that nonetheless took her nearly an hour of pacing around the kitchen to work up the courage to ask. David sounded surprised to hear from her, guarded at first, the way people often are when someone who withdrew from them suddenly reappears without explanation, but he answered her question, and the call lasted 20 minutes longer than either of them expected it to. By the end of the 2nd month, Eleanor had filled 2 full notebooks, front to back, in handwriting that had grown steadily more confident with each passing week. She began sharing small passages with her sister Barbara over the phone. Tentatively at first, the way a person tests whether an old bridge will still hold their weight after years of neglect, Barbara cried on the other end of the line during their 3rd such conversation. Not out of pity for Eleanor, but out of a kind of recognition that surprised them both, an admission that Barbara herself had been quietly struggling with similar feelings of invisibility since her own youngest child had left for the army 2 years earlier. Margaret asked, almost shyly, whether she could read one of the entries too during their regular Sunday call, and Eleanor mailed her a photocopy the following week, her hands shaking slightly as she sealed the envelope at the post office. She had spent 2 full years believing with a kind of quiet certainty that she had nothing left worth sharing with the people she loved most in the world. She was only beginning in that 3rd month to understand how deeply mistaken that belief had actually been, and how much of her own silence had been self-imposed rather than forced upon her by circumstance. Not every part of that 3rd month went smoothly, however, and it would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. Eleanor brought a printed page of her writing to Carol's small weekly gathering of women, meeting for the first time in the back room of the community library, and one of the women there, a retired accountant named Judith, offered criticism that stung far more than Eleanor expected it to. Judith suggested, not unkindly but bluntly, that Eleanor's writing leaned too heavily on sadness, that readers would eventually grow tired of grief without some thread of forward motion to hold on to. Eleanor went home that evening, seriously doubting whether any of this was worth continuing, and it took a long phone call with Carol that night to talk her out of quitting entirely. Carol's advice that night was simple, and Eleanor would return to it many times in the months that followed. She told Eleanor that Judith was not wrong, exactly, but that criticism arriving too early in a person's growth can sometimes do as much damage as no feedback at all. The point of those 90 days, Carol reminded her, was never to produce something perfect. It was to prove to herself, privately and without an audience, that she was still capable of showing up for her own life. Eleanor went back to her notebook the next morning at 5:15, a little shaken, but she went back nonetheless. And that decision to continue despite the sting of Judith's words turned out to matter more than either woman fully realized at the time. In the 4th month, on what began as an entirely ordinary Tuesday, Eleanor did something that would have seemed unthinkable to her only 4 months earlier. She typed up a short essay about caregiving, about grief, about the particular and largely invisible loneliness of being a woman whose usefulness the world quietly assumes has already expired once her children are grown and her husband has passed. She submitted it to the community section of the local newspaper, telling absolutely no one, certain the piece would be politely rejected or simply ignored altogether. She nearly forgot she had sent it at all, until 2 weeks later when her neighbor knocked on her front door holding a folded copy of that week's paper. Eleanor's own words printed clearly on page 6, above her own full name. The response to that single essay was more than Eleanor could have reasonably imagined going in. Letters arrived at the newspaper's small office from women across 3 surrounding counties, many of them describing the exact same quiet disappearance Eleanor had lived through herself, some of them from women 20 years older, some from women barely into their 40s. A local women's community center invited her to speak at their monthly gathering, an invitation Eleanor very nearly declined out of pure fear before Carol firmly talked her out of backing down. If you have something to say, Carol told her over coffee that week, the fear does not go away before you say it. It goes away because you said it anyway. Before we go any further into what happened next, if this story has already reminded you of a season in your own life, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight and what that season looked like for you. We read every single comment, and more of you share these quiet chapters than you might expect. Eleanor stood in front of 40 strangers that evening at the community center, notebook in hand, her voice shaking noticeably during the first 2 sentences before slowly steadying. She read the words she had written alone at her kitchen table months earlier, about the porch light, about the empty hallway, about the granddaughter whose question had finally broken something open inside her. When she finished, the room was silent for a long moment, long enough that Eleanor briefly feared she had misjudged the entire evening badly, and then it was not silent at all. Several women in the audience were crying openly. Others were already lining up afterward to ask when she planned to speak again, and whether the writing circle Carol had mentioned was accepting new members. Word of that evening spread through the town faster than Eleanor expected, the way small-town news often does, passed from one porch conversation to the next, until it reached corners of Maple Grove Avenue. Eleanor had assumed no longer paid her any attention at all. A features editor from a regional newspaper in Columbus, one with considerably more reach than the small community paper that had first published her essay, reached out within the month, asking whether Eleanor would be willing to expand her original piece into a longer feature about women rebuilding their lives after loss in midlife. Eleanor said yes before she had fully finished reading the email, a decision that would have been unthinkable to the woman sitting alone on that porch step only 5 months earlier. The feature ran on a Sunday in March, accompanied by a photograph of Eleanor standing in her own garden, the same garden she had let go to weeds for 2 years and had only recently begun replanting, section by section on the mornings when writing did not come easily. The response this time reached well beyond the 3 counties that had written in after her first small essay. Women from other states began emailing the newspaper directly, asking how to find writing groups like Carol's in their own towns. A local television station requested an interview, which Eleanor accepted only after Carol sat with her through 3 full rehearsals at the kitchen table, the same table where the entire 90-day experiment had first quietly begun. It was around this time, nearly 6 months after that first porch conversation, that Eleanor finally told her children the full story, all of it, including the parts she had never planned on sharing with anyone. She told Margaret about the porch, about the 4 in the morning coffee she never drank, about how close she had genuinely come in that second year of grief to a decision none of them could have recovered from. Margaret cried on the phone for nearly 10 minutes before she could speak again. And when Eleanor finally called David to tell him the same story, the distance that had grown between them over the previous 2 years began, slowly and imperfectly, to close, one honest conversation at a time. David flew in from Chicago the following month, the first time he had visited Maple Grove Avenue since Richard's funeral nearly 3 years earlier. He sat in the same kitchen where his mother had once complained about tracked in dirt, and where she had later written the sentence that started everything, and he told her, somewhat awkwardly, that he had spent 2 years angry at her for refusing to sell the house when in reality he had simply been afraid of losing her the same sudden way he had lost his father. Eleanor understood that fear better than she let on, because she had lived inside a version of it herself for 2 long years, and the conversation that followed was the most honest one mother and son had shared in over a decade. By the 1-year mark from that first porch conversation, Eleanor Hayes had published 4 essays in regional publications, spoken at 6 community events across 2 counties, and grown Carol's original small writing circle from 6 women meeting in the back room of the library into nearly 30 women meeting in the town's community center twice a month. What had begun as a private 90-day experiment to see whether she could show up for herself had, without either woman fully intending it, become something considerably larger than either of them, a small but genuine movement among women in midlife who had quietly assumed their most meaningful chapters were already behind them. Eleanor still wakes at 5:15 every single morning, not out of obligation, but because that hour has become the one part of her day that belongs entirely and only to her. She has since been approached by a small regional publisher about turning her collected essays into a book, a possibility she is still considering carefully, unwilling to rush something that began so quietly into something that feels performed. Her granddaughter Lily now tells anyone who will listen that her grandmother is writing a book, and says it with a pride that makes Eleanor's throat tighten every single time she hears it repeated at family dinners. When people ask Eleanor what changed that made all of this possible, starting from a single conversation on a porch step at 5 in the morning, she gives roughly the same answer every time, though the exact words shift slightly depending on who is asking. Nothing outside of her changed first, she says. She simply stopped waiting for permission to matter and started proving it to herself, one quiet hour at a time, long before anyone else in the world was awake to witness it or offer their approval. It is easy, she often adds, to assume that the most important chapters of a woman's life end once the children are grown and the house finally goes quiet. Eleanor Hayes has become living proof to her family, to her town, and now to strangers she has never met, that for many women, that quiet moment is not an ending at all. It is only the moment the real story finally begins. If Eleanor's story moved you even a little tonight, we want to know, somewhere in your own life right now, there may be an hour you have not claimed for yourself yet, one small piece of the day still waiting to be reclaimed. Tell us in the comments what you would do with that hour, if you gave yourself permission to take it starting tomorrow morning. And if you know a woman who has quietly gone silent the way Eleanor once did, someone whose porch light has stayed on out of habit rather than hope, consider sending her this video tonight. Sometimes the smallest nudge from someone who cares is the only thing standing between a woman and the life she has not yet allowed herself to imagine.